Hi, my name is Christy Call, editorial director of Cure Magazine. In this edition of the Speaking Out video series, on behalf of the National Pancreas Foundation, we're talking with Dr. Andrew Lowy from Moore's Cancer Center at UC San Diego Health about clinical trials in pancreatic cancer. Hi, and welcome.
Hi, glad to be here.
Thanks. To start, why would you say it's important for patients to consider joining a clinical trial?
Sure. Well, this is a topic I'm very passionate about because our goal is to cure pancreas cancer and make the lives of pancreas cancer patients better. And the only way we can advance in this mission is to study the new treatments that we are developing. And, what I always point out to patients is every medicine that you have taken has been studied at some point, likely in a clinical trial. Drugs cannot get approved unless they're studied in clinical trials. So everything that we take for granted as a standard of care medicine once was the study of, once was studied in a clinical trial. And so the only way we can advance is to study things in a rigorous way, and that's what clinical trials are all about.
Absolutely. And so, how can patients learn more about clinical trials that they might be eligible for?
So there's a variety of ways. Obviously, your own physician or the cancer center where you're being treated usually will have information for you, but the National Cancer Institute has a great website called clinicaltrials.gov in which you can search for a clinical trial based on a number of keywords, your disease, pancreas cancer, your stage, et cetera, and it will list a lot of information about it. Uh, you know, uh, Foundations which support pancreas cancer patients, like National Pancreas Foundation, can often help the American Cancer Society, the Pancreatic Cancer Action Network. All of these agencies are foundations are there to support you and provide information.
Okay, and so to help our patients understand a little bit more about trials, can you discuss the types of trials that do exist for pancreatic cancer research?
Sure. So clinical trials are basically divided into what we call phases. Phase 1, 2, and 3 are the most common trials that you're going to hear about. And each of those phases have a different goal, and they are studying drugs at different stages of their development. So phase 1 trials are the first phase of drug development in which the drug is being introduced into patients. Phase 1 trials are generally designed to understand what the best dose is, or what we call the maximally tolerated dose most often, and what the side effects of the drug is. They're not designed to typically study a single disease. They're usually given to patients with multiple cancers and usually advanced cancers who have failed other therapies. And they are interested in the activity of the drug that is being monitored, but it's not the primary goal, because always our first goal when we treat patients is safety. And so we want to understand that drugs are safe, that they don't have side effects, which we think are intolerable or inappropriate to treat patients with. And so that's phase 1. After phase 1, once the dose is established and it's safe, when there's a hint of efficacy, meaning that the drugs seem to have activity, they'll select a disease or a couple of diseases to study in the next phase, or phase 2. And phase 2 is really the phase where you're trying to get a better sense of how effective the drug is. And so that phase will either consist of a single group of patients, all who get the same treatment, or sometimes two groups of patients, some of whom will get the study drug, and others who will just get the standard of care agents. And it depends a little bit on the design. After phase 2, when there's a sense that this drug seems to be working and we're excited about it, then it goes to phase 3, or what we often call the registration phase. And that's where the experimental drug, the new drug, will get compared to the previous standard of care. In pancreas cancer, those trials typically consist of chemotherapy plus the experimental drug versus chemotherapy alone, since chemotherapy is the standard of care for most stages of pancreas cancer. And then if that trial demonstrates that the experimental drug improved the outcomes to the extent that we think is adequate to approve it, then it will become an approved drug and become a standard of care.
Okay, great. And so with that, I know you'd mentioned standard of care, and sometimes trials can also be given standard of care plus placebo to test a new agent. But oftentimes we also hear that as a misconception about a clinical trial. The patient will only receive a placebo. Are there other misconceptions that maybe we can try to negate and encourage patients to want to join a trial?
Yeah, so this is a really important question that you're asking. So first of all, it's important for patients to understand that placebo or sugar pills or essentially non-effective medicines are almost never given in trials for pancreas cancer patients. And that's because it wouldn't be ethical to give a patient a treatment which has no activity in a disease as significant, as serious as pancreas cancer. So usually the trials either are a single arm where everyone's getting the experimental drug, or a randomization where half the patients are getting, again, the standard of care, and the other half is getting the standard of care plus the new drug. So it's an additive type of situation. So that's, there are rare situations where there's placebos, but those are situations where patients have usually been rendered free of disease after surgery, for instance. They've gotten their chemotherapy, and now you're studying whether the standard of care, which would normally be to do nothing else except watch, if there's something better than that, like give a vaccine, for instance. So that would be the only circumstance where you'd be talking about a no treatment arm. And that's where no treatment is the standard. The other misconception that people have is that somehow being on a clinical trial means you're a guinea pig, or we're experimenting, and that's just not the case. I just talked about the phases of trials and how we don't give drugs to patients until they've been rigorously tested for for activity and safety and so forth. And so, there are ethics review boards called IRBs, which have to review every clinical trial to make sure they're ethical before they can be opened and given to patients. And the thing that I also tell patients is clinical trials are so closely monitored to make sure that they are adhering to the standards and to what is written in the clinical trial. And there's lots of data actually suggesting that patients enrolled in clinical trials have better outcomes than patients who are not on clinical trials. And we think that's because there's a larger care team that's mandatory. There are additional people monitoring your care, making sure you get your treatment on schedule, your scans on schedule, and that your side effects are very closely monitored. Which is not as rigorous always when people are treated off a clinical trial.
Okay. And so what would you say is your biggest piece of advice for a patient who's considering joining a clinical trial?
Well, obviously, the most important thing is to understand what the trial is about, what is going to be involved, what's going to be required of you, and what the potential benefits and the potential risks of an experimental drug are. But I strongly encourage people to keep an open mind. One of our problems in the pancreas cancer field is less than 10% of patients with pancreas cancer go on a clinical trial, despite the fact that this disease has such a low cure rate. And the only way that we can increase that cure rate is to get new drugs approved and to show that they work. And to do that, we have to perform these clinical trials. And so the more people who enroll, the faster we can make progress against this disease.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome.